threatened final attack appears to have begun by forces loyal to President Assad, aided by Russian airstrikes. This as Barack Obama arrives in Europe on his final trip of his presidency to reassure worried allies his successor, Donald Trump, will not be reshaping the established world order.
Also tonight, the Channel 4 News investigation into Conservative Party election expenses opens new questions for the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff. We reveal how Nick Timothy, Theresa May's closest advisor, played a part in the controversial campaign in South Thanet, which is now under investigation by the police. How's the government coping with Brexit? A memo from consultants Deloitte suggests chaos. Downing Street denies all, but has the note hit the nail on the head? And the routes for the next high-speed rail lines are announced, but there's still uncertainty over where the new station for Sheffield will be.
Airstrikes, barrel bombs have rained down upon rebel-held neighbourhoods in eastern Aleppo today as Russia announced the start of a major operation in the Syrian provinces of Idlib and Homs. Russia denies it has resumed attacks on Aleppo, but said it had launched missiles at jihadist groups elsewhere. Activists fear the resumption signals that the government's assault on the east will now be stepped up. Our chief correspondent, Alex Thompson, has this report.
The weeks of warnings are over. Today, Russia's battle group went to war as Europe talked and the US admitted failure. Cruise missiles from the frigate Admiral Grigorovich today launched at Idlib and Homs provinces in northern Syria. Russian Defense Ministry pictures showing the Kuznetsov carrier doing the job she steamed through the English Channel to do, fight a war for the first time. Yesterday, one of her planes crashed, the pilot ditching, but today in Moscow, the brass wanted to announce history in the making.
For the first time in Russian naval history, the aircraft carrier was involved in combat actions.
But hold on for a sec, let's bring that plane back on deck. Closer inspection reveals only air-to-air missiles. Unequipped to bomb Syrian rebels, these flights, not filmed today, appear to be for reconnaissance and PR. Russia says it didn't bomb rebel-held, besieged East Aleppo today and added it hasn't done so for 28 days. But as these pictures indicate, there were airstrikes into that zone today, the Syrian government confirming attacks. Today, the World Food Programme said shortages in East Aleppo are now becoming critical.
We're extremely concerned about the situation in eastern Aleppo at the moment, where the last food rations that have been provided by the UN have been given out. It's very hard to say how people will be coping there.
As if to underline that, for the first time, street protests in East Aleppo yesterday against food shortages, surreptitiously filmed, demanding the overthrow of the makeshift administration. Shots were fired. By no means all of East Aleppo is reduced to rubble like this. Where undamaged buildings exist, and in many areas they do, people are growing their own food on the rooftops to eke out supplies as the siege continues. There is suffering, of course, on both sides in this divided city. Russian TV and Syrian governments reporting in recent days that rebels have used shells loaded with chlorine gas to attack West Aleppo on several occasions. Syrian government forces also stand accused of using gas in the city. So as Russia ramps up its war plan, America, lost, nowhere, owns up to total strategic failure in Syria.
We're going to have to continue to try to pursue, as best we can, a political solution, and in the interim, put as much pressure as we can to the parties to arrive at humanitarian safe spaces and ceasefires that at least alleviate the suffering that's on the ground. I recognize that that has not worked, and it is something that I continue to think about every day.
A lame duck president ponders failure every day, he says, but leaves millions of Syrians on all sides just pondering survival every day.
Well, I've been speaking via the internet to people on both sides of the front lines in Aleppo. In a moment, we'll hear the view from the government-controlled West. But first, I talked to English teacher Wissam Zaka, who is in the besieged eastern part of the city. I asked him what he'd witnessed today, how often the airstrikes are happening.
I can't tell, because here, like in my neighborhood, over the past hour, 2 places were attacked. I don't know where exactly, but it seems we are in the south. In the west, it's heavier. Every now and then, someone would send the voice of the warplane to the sky and the sound of the rockets exploding. No one can tell how heavy the shelling is. Usually, number of victims would tell something. We don't have the numbers for today yet. Like 2 people died in my neighborhood, but it wasn't from a warplane. Sorry. Now it's a warplane. Now my neighborhood is targeted now. And in the afternoon, it started afternoon after 12. At that time, I was at school. I heard the sound, but I wasn't sure if they were from warplanes. I discovered later when I finished school at 4 that people were looking at the sky trying to know what's happening or where is the next target. So it seems that the attacks from the sky are back again.
You say you were at school when it started again.
Yeah.
How did the children react?
In fact, they didn't know. It wasn't in that neighborhood, and the nature of the building, and because it's a bit noisy at school, they didn't realize that warplanes were back in the sky. They discovered that when they left school. The people were looking at the sky, as I told you. But like at school, we didn't know that it was from warplanes. We just heard some noise. We thought, as usual, it's from artillery or such things.
What do you think this means for you?
But it's a new stage. It's clear that it's a new stage. Like we've heard that the regime militias are preparing themselves to attack. So maybe this is just the start.
And food is running out there. Can you tell me what the situation is? How much do people have?
Yeah, here we depend a lot on bread in our eating regime. So bread is getting more difficult to get.
Wissam Zaka talking to me from East Aleppo a little earlier. Well, now the view from the government-held West and Aleppo's MP, Farah Shahabi. Did he recognise the reports of bombing happening right now in East Aleppo?
Actually, few airstrikes took place at that hit Al-Qaeda headquarters in eastern Aleppo. But so far, nothing like the international coalition process in Mosul. We would like to see even half of what's going on in Mosul.
If what you say is correct, and that there are civilians who don't want to be trapped in East Aleppo right now, isn't there a grave danger that many of them are going to be killed by Syrian bombing in the next few days?
Look, our bombing is not random. It's not blind. And we gave them so many ceasefires. Let us just remember this. We gave them 4 or 5 consecutive ceasefires, and we set up safety corridors. Just last Friday, that was last time we set up a safety corridor. They don't use it. They don't want to get out peacefully.
But
they don't want to
according to your own figures, there are approximately 5,000 or 6,000 fighters in eastern Aleppo, people you call terrorists. And there are more than 200,000 civilians, perhaps 250,000. We've already seen it happen in the past. We know what happens now. We know how this goes. You're going to kill a lot of people.
Look, who's going to kill a lot of people are not us, are the ones who are taking them human shields and hiding behind them. Bear in mind, these civilians are our civilians. They are our relatives. They are our cousins. They are our friends. And we will free them. It's not like we're going to bomb them. And this is not only a an air campaign. There were going to be troops on the ground, there are going to be police forces, and we would open safety corridors.
The people in the East, many of them say that they do not trust the civilian corridors as long as they are being run by Syrian and Russian forces. Would you be prepared to invite in the United Nations or other international groups to ensure the safety of those humanitarian corridors?
Look, the safety corridors worked in so many places in Syria, in Damascus area, in Homs, so many places. I'm not talking about 1 or 2 places. I'm talking about 20 or 30 different occasions where we had safety corridors and people chose to leave or people chose to settle, to do reconciliation. This is not something, to really dig into. We are not the ones under question here.
Aleppo's MP, Farah Shahabi, speaking to me earlier. John.
As Russia resumed its attacks on Syria, Barack Obama flew into Europe on his final visit of the presidency. What has been expected to be a goodbye swan song has now turned into a mission to try to reassure European allies that the US will continue to honour its international commitments, including those to NATO, when his successor Donald Trump arrives in the White House. Our Washington correspondent Kylie Morris joins us now from Washington. Kylie.
John, this was a very reflective Barack Obama, I think, who is really on a bittersweet journey. Rather than travelling through Europe and talking about his legacy and the hopes for the American future, he is now being asked effectively on the international stage to explain how it is that Donald Trump won this election, someone with such a different worldview to his. He defended himself today saying, look, I'm actually quite popular at the moment, and it's true, his polls are fairly high for someone who's leaving office. But he rejects the idea that this is about his worldview. He says that simply this was about a yearning for change, people who are trapped by globalization, who really simply wanted to shake things up. Now, how exactly Donald Trump is going to shake things up is being decided in Trump Towers in these days. He's still looking at these key appointments. Who should be his Secretary of State? Who should be his Secretary of Defense? And those people who would advise him, certainly, for example, on what to do about Syria, are really kind of presenting their cases at court, if you will, within, this Midtown Manhattan gleaming tower, trying to persuade Donald Trump to the rightness of their views. We don't really know what Donald Trump will do in Syria. I mean, he talked a broadly kind of isolationist approach, but at the same time, he seems to be at least courting better relations with Russia. So does that mean that the Americans will simply get out of the space and leave it to the Russians? It's really not clear, and there are very concerned attitudes, I think, from people here who know a lot about foreign policy and had hoped that there would be a change in American policy. But at this stage, people really don't know what it will be. It is being decided, and indeed the new world order, fairly much according to the Americans, and how the Americans see the world is being decided in Manhattan today, tomorrow, and just until Donald Trump makes his way finally to the White House. There is nothing less at play in the gilded lobby of Trump Tower than the future direction of the United States and its policy toward the outside world. Hour by hour, the courtiers come to make their bidding to the president-elect. While he chooses a cabinet, the world turns, and nation-states hungry for power look for advantage.
Well, I think it's fair to say that I was surprised by the election results.
The current president has become a reluctant envoy. Barack Obama in Europe reassuring NATO allies that despite Trumpian criticism of the alliance, there's no weakening of resolve.
I still don't feel responsible for what the president-elect says or does, but I do feel a responsibility as President of the United States to make sure that I facilitate a good transition, and I present to him, as well as the American people, my best thinking, my best ideas about how you move the country forward.
But will his successor listen? Trump's approach to any council so far seems to be my way or the highway. Back in August, dozens of the country's most senior Republican national security experts signed a letter against Donald Trump.
From a foreign policy perspective, Donald Trump is not qualified to be president and commander-in-chief. Indeed, we are convinced that he would be a dangerous president and would put at risk our country's national security and well-being.
The Trump Tower doors seem closed to them. One neocon and former State Department official gave this Twitter update of his efforts to engage Team Trump.
After exchange with Trump transition team, changed my recommendation. Stay away. They're angry, arrogant, screaming. You lost. Will be ugly.
Negotiating the purchase and building of a golf course in Scotland is not the same as dealing with a sovereign state with nuclear weapons. And he needs to understand that, and he needs to turn to people who know what they're doing, even though they may have spoken out against him. If he does not, it is deeply disturbing and potentially very damaging.
Old hands know what propaganda the Russians can make over phone call. Hours after Donald Trump told Vladimir Putin he's looking forward to a strong, enduring relationship, Russian jets renewed their bombing of civilian targets in Syria.
I think people have misunderstood what Trump said.
A leading candidate for Secretary of State sought to extinguish any suggestion Trump had given the Russians a green light in Syria.
Trump will be a far stronger leader, and in that sense, there's a greater potential for keeping the Russians within appropriate lanes and, paradoxically, perhaps, greater possibility for cooperation.
Do we know, though, that this isn't a deliberate policy shift from Donald Trump being articulated, which the Russians are interpreting correctly?
We don't know. I think this will be a very early test of what his policy is. It's a very dangerous time, and he needs the best advice he can get, and he needs to listen to it.
The man who likes to act on impulse, surrounded now by the most complex of problems. There is some clarity, though, today about some key appointments in Congress. Paul Ryan, who was someone who sometimes endorsed, sometimes disendorsed Donald Trump, certainly had a difficult relationship with the Trump campaign, who was the Speaker of the House. He has been returned to that position. So certainly there will be establishment Republicans who will be very happy to see that, and there is a sign at least that that Donald Trump, when he comes into the White House, will have a familiar Congress at least to deal with. On the other side, though, the Democrats, they've decided to defer their election that was meant to be held today. That's bad news for the establishment Democrats, who wanted the status quo to continue and Nancy Pelosi to be re-elected. But there are those now, of course, within the Democratic Party who want real change. They want real change in Congress, and they want someone else in that position, not Nancy Pelosi. They've deferred for another week while people can put forward their candidacy. So there will be likely change there.
Thanks, Kylie. Now, while questions remain about the policy approach of the new American president, the government here has spent the day countering accusations it doesn't have a plan for its own challenge of how Britain will leave the European Union. Downing Street insisted that a leaked memo which questioned the approach of ministers and civil servants to Brexit wasn't commissioned by the government, and said the author did not have access to number 10. So what, if anything, does the leak tell us about how the government is coping with Brexit? Here's our political editor, Gary Gibbon.
The memo, headed Brexit Update, written a week ago by an employee of Deloitte, who's been working inside Whitehall, says that well over 500 projects on Brexit are being worked on, which are beyond the capacity and capability of government to execute quickly. Thanks to government fears of splits, the memo says, there will be no clear economic Brexit strategy anytime soon, because it is being developed on a case-by-case basis as specific decisions are forced on government.
At any time in Whitehall, you often find a few people from the big management consultancy and accountancy firms working behind desks. But the Brexit decision added to their numbers, bringing in a whole load of people quite often working for free. Even though this report is authored by someone who isn't a full-time civil servant, it echoes a lot of the sentiments you hear from full-time officials. And the government was keen to stamp on it.
A lot of civil servants would agree with this document.
Well, this is not a report we've known about, it's not a report we've commissioned, it's not a report that we recognise.
Still might be accurate.
Well, I have not seen anything in the work I've been doing to support the Brexit team would suggest to me that some of the claims made in this document are right.
A think tank that's been talking to civil servants across departments to get their views on how government's coping with Brexit says a secretive approach at the top of government, dictated by political concerns, means officials aren't able to provide best advice.
So to government ministers who go around saying this is unrecognisable, Brexit isn't working like this at all, it's all very smooth.
Well, it may appear smooth from the centre, I think, but from the perspective of lots of people in Whitehall departments and from people outside government, it's a very opaque process, and that is a problem. It's not going to get us the best possible outcome in terms of a good exit from the EU.
And it's one they don't think they've got the resources to complete.
Exactly. I think that Whitehall can absolutely deliver Brexit successfully. They
But
just
only if it doesn't do a whole load of other things.
can't necessarily do it alongside everything else.
Theresa May last night at the Lord Mayor's banquet. Number 10 attacked the Times for publishing the leak, saying the original report wasn't commissioned by the Cabinet Office and didn't have civil service input. Deloitte in a statement said it didn't have departmental input. The Prime Minister's Brexit plan is still to leave as many options on the table as possible for now, a plan slightly undermined by the Foreign Secretary, who let slip in an interview for a Czech newspaper that Britain was probably going to leave the customs union. For good measure, Mr Johnson also told the newspaper that Donald Trump seemed to him, in many aspects, a Liberal guy from New York.
Gary Gibbon reporting. Well, earlier I spoke to the Lib Dems EU spokesman and former Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg. I asked him whether he believed the civil service would need to bring tens of thousands more people in to make Brexit happen.
One of the things that the arch Brexiteers will never admit, because they were the ones who ranted and railed against red tape and bureaucracy and expense, is that actually Brexit is going to turn out to be a very expensive thing to do. Already, because of the decline in the pound, our contributions to the EU budget have skyrocketed. It'll create an absolute tsunami wave of additional bureaucrats and bureaucracy, particularly if we leave the customs union, which is what the hard Brexiteers appear to want. You know, one of the many ironies is that the Brexiteers themselves and their failure to agree amongst themselves what Brexit actually means is creating an absolute bonanza for consultants and bureaucrats.
Isn't your duty now as a Democrat to simply put your head down and say, look, I lost, we didn't manage to win that referendum, may have been advisory and the rest, but the train has left the station. My duty now is to make this thing work in the best interests of the British people. Isn't it time you did that?
Yeah, I do think I have a duty, which I'm trying to discharge as well as I can, as a opposition MP, which is what you do in our constitutional democracy, which is to hold the government to account for its actions and for its decisions. The problem is we don't have any decisions from the government. We don't know what the government means when it says Brexit means Brexit, and more, in my view, ludicrously, the government appears to wish to evade and avoid any meaningful parliamentary scrutiny or accountability altogether, which is why they're now spending even more taxpayers' money on lawyers' fees to appeal the High Court ruling on Article 50 in the Supreme Court. But you can't hold a government to account if it's not prepared to come up with any apparent decisions about what it really wants to do next.
Now, it's pretty clear that the Treasury is not in charge of this operation. It's hard to imagine that either Gordon Brown or George Osborne would ever have allowed these very intricate, very intimate issues that affect the British economy and the way in which Britain is structured to fall into the hands of completely different departments.
Absolutely, and the Treasury is being asked to swallow economic nonsenses, because we're being told by Boris Johnson and Liam Fox and David Davis, who sort of whistle in the wind and they say, oh, it's going to be absolutely fine, even though investment is drying up, even though it's obvious that prices are going to go up, even though we are now all materially poorer. So I do think it is important that at some point the Treasury simply restates the laws of economic gravity, which is yanking ourselves out in this shambolic way from our largest trading markets right on our geographic doorstep, will have a material economic consequence on the country as a whole. Now, maybe that's a price people want to pay, but at least the government has the duty to spell out those costs and not keep repeating these platitudes which somehow suggest that Brexit means Brexit without spelling out what that means, and somehow everything will be all okay in the end without spelling out how that will actually occur.
Nick Clegg. Well, Google has given a boost to post-Brexit Britain by announcing it plans to hire up to 3,000 staff at its new headquarters in London. The company's boss, Sundar Pichai, said the search engine giant was committed to the UK, but stressed that open borders and freedom of movement for skilled migrants were crucial to the success of the technology sector. He said that he would worry if controls on skilled migration were made more stringent. There's also been a surprise drop in inflation last month. Though the price of petrol shot up, many areas of the economy, including clothing and toys, saw slower price rises, leaving the annual rate of inflation at just 0.9%. But things may be about to get tougher, with the price of raw materials paid by factories rising at its fastest rate on record last month.
He's been called the most powerful man in Britain. But tonight, Nick Timothy, the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, is in the spotlight for his role in the Conservative election expenses scandal. This programme has confirmed that Mr Timothy played a part in the controversial campaign in South Thanet, which is now under investigation by the police. The party insists Mr Timothy and other key workers sent to that constituency worked only on the national campaign and not for the local candidate. But new evidence obtained by this programme, Channel 4 News, suggests key Conservatives did work on the local campaign. And there are serious questions for the MP, Craig McKinley, over whether he fully disclosed everything he knew about the operation to the police. Michael Crick has this exclusive report.
For many months, this programme's been investigating what the Conservatives spent at the 2015 election. And we've found evidence of questionable spending in many seats. But one stands out. South Thanet in Kent, where the party thwarted UKIP leader Nigel Farage. And a key figure in South Thanet was Nick Timothy, who now, as Theresa May's Joint Chief of Staff in number 10, is said to be the most powerful man in Britain. Described by one minister as her Rasputin. No wonder Mr Putin sought him out. The Conservatives are playing down Timothy's role in Thanet, but tonight we reveal its full extent. Indeed, Nick Timothy was widely credited with winning the South Thanet campaign.
Nick Timothy had some success helping to run various by-election campaigns before the 2010 election, and Linton Crosby was clear that he was the right man to take charge of the campaign in South Thanet. So he went down there with that experience and with a fine mind for political campaigning, and effectively helped shake things up and took charge of that operation and delivered a success for the Tories.
And the Conservatives, we've found, spent tens of thousands of pounds in South Thanet. Money either not declared on the local legal return, or which they claimed was national spending, which is also regulated by law. The Electoral Commission and Kent Police are now investigating our findings. At the heart of these investigations is a very simple question. Did the Conservative candidate here last year, Craig McKinley, now the MP, properly declare all the money that was spent on his campaign, as he was obliged to do under the law? Or did the Conservatives spend far more and instead claim that it was part of their national campaign, rather than the local effort to get him elected? This is the Royal Harbour Hotel in Ramsgate. During the 2015 Thanet campaign, the Conservatives hired this plush location as an HQ for the crack team sent down to make sure McKinley beat Farage. Several key figures in the Tory campaign had rooms here, as the owner told me earlier this year.
It was a sort of, headquarters for them?
It was, yes. Well, all hotels become headquarters, unofficially sometimes, but they all hang around and somewhere they can talk and eat.
The team at the Royal Harbour included Sam Armstrong from the Conservative campaign department, Marion Little, Tory campaign specialist, and the party's former head of press, Henry McCrory, on contract. But reportedly in charge of strategy was Nick Timothy, temporarily stood down as Mrs May's top political advisor at the Home Office. We found Mr Timothy on one picture lurking behind May and the Tory candidate Craig McKinley.
Craig McKinley, the Conservative Party candidate.
Two respected books about the election and the Conservative Home website have talked about how Timothy led the campaign in South Thanet. He was praised too on Twitter.
Great to see Nick Timothy, who ran Craig McKinley's campaign in Thanet, is to lead the New Schools Network. Congratulations.
Mr Timothy even retweeted that and replied,
"Thanks, Peter. See you soon."
And in a phone call with Channel 4 News last May, Nick Timothy seemed to confirm his work in the seat, telling us,
"I was in Thanet. I worked on a variety of things to do with the campaign in Thanet and around the country."
When we asked Conservative headquarters about Nick Timothy's role in the South Thanet campaign, this is what they said. During the 2015 general election, Mr. Timothy was a volunteer for the Conservative Party. His role included briefing policy and political work on Home Office policy, briefing party spokespeople on Home Office policy, supporting Theresa May, and working on a variety of other matters for the Conservative Party during the campaign. But that doesn't explain why Mr. Timothy felt the need to stay here in the constituency where the party wanted to defeat Nigel Farage. Nor does it explain why so many people thought Mr. Timothy was the brains behind the campaign, sent down here by Lynton Crosby.
And that is what Kent police are looking at. Because if Nick Timothy and his colleagues did work on Craig McKinley's local campaign, at least some of the £14,000 spent at this hotel should have been declared. And that would have put them way over the legal limit of just over £15,000. But neither McKinley nor his agent declared a penny of the Royal Harbour bill. Instead, it went on the Tories' national spending return.
Earlier this year, Detective Sergeant Brian Gillam of the Serious Crime Directorate of Kent Police wrote to Craig McKinley and asked him a very direct question. Had any of the people who stayed at the Royal Harbour Hotel been engaged on the local campaign at any time?
The MP replied,
I can confirm that nobody staying at the hotel was subject to my or my agent's control or direction. Any National Conservative Party staff based in the Royal Harbour Hotel were part of a national campaign team.
And yet we've examined scores of pictures and documents from the Thanet contest which show not just Nick Timothy, but others at the Royal Harbour were closely involved in Craig McKinley's campaign.
We've got numerous photographs showing Henry McCrory out campaigning with Craig McKinley. There's McCrory, there is McKinley. On that one, there is McCrory and McKinley again. Not only that, South Thanet Conservatives issued numerous press releases in which they advised journalists to contact Henry McCrory and even gave his mobile phone number at the bottom. It's hard to think of a more clear example than a press release to show that somebody was closely involved in the local campaign. And there are pictures, too, of another Royal Harbour guest, Sam Armstrong. There he is, out on the streets with Craig McKinley. And so involved was Mr. Armstrong in Craig McKinley's campaign, he even registered a website called whereisnigel.com to try and show that Nigel Farage was hardly ever in the South Thanet constituency.
Later, as an MP at Westminster, McKinley made Sam Armstrong his Chief of Staff. The SNP MP Tommy Shepherd queries why, if Nick Timothy and his colleagues weren't helping Craig McKinley, did they base themselves in a remote seaside resort in Kent?
That seems an odd place to base your national campaign staff. So, you know, it looks very likely, and there is a lot of evidence to suggest that these people were directly and centrally involved in Mr. McKinley's campaign, and the expenses related to that ought to have been declared. And I think, I guess, I think it's time to come clean.
Craig McKinley says his local spending declaration was lawful and proper, while the Conservatives say they've always acted entirely in accordance with the law. Nick Timothy, they add, hasn't been interviewed by either the police or the Electoral Commission. Kent Police told us their officers are still investigating, working with the Commission.
Michael Crick reporting, and you can find out more of this and more coverage of the whole election expenses story on our website, channel4.com/news. Krishnan.
Now, prison officers have returned to work following a 24-hour protest after the government won a High Court injunction to halt the action, which it argued amounted to an illegal strike. Up to 10,000 prison officers in England and Wales stopped work, protesting at what they said was a surge in violence and a meltdown in the prison system. The protest brought a number of court cases to a standstill, including the trial of Thomas Mair, who's accused of murdering the MP Jo Cox. Our Home Affairs correspondent Andy Davis reports.
In Cardiff, as elsewhere, the protest started early this morning. Here we counted around 50 officers outside, responding only to emergencies. Inside, all visits were cancelled, we were told, all workshops. It was meals and medication only, said one officer. Another said they'd had enough of the violence, citing 2 very recent incidents.
Saturday, 2 members of staff were assaulted by a prisoner after being escorted out of domestic visits.
Badly injured?
Cuts and bruises, blow to the head on another prisoner. Both were sent home, one for treatment and yet to return.
It's symptomatic, say the main prison officer union, of a deteriorating situation. It was a breakdown in talks with government officials over safety issues which triggered this action, and it comes at the end of a very difficult fortnight for the prison service. Last week, here at Pentonville in North London, these 2 men, Matthew Baker on the left and James Whitlock, escaped. They've since been caught. While earlier this month, up to 200 inmates went on the rampage through Bedford Prison, it took riot officers more than 6 hours to take back control, which is exactly what the Justice Secretary wanted to do today.
Over the last 2 weeks, my team has been holding talks with the POA on a range of measures to improve safety. These talks were due to continue this morning. Instead, the POA failed to respond to our proposals and called this unlawful action without giving any notice. We are taking the necessary legal steps to end this unlawful industrial action.
It's illegal for prison officers to take industrial action, but the POA claimed it was the government who was breaching its duty to officers. The argument ended up in the High Court this afternoon, where the Ministry of Justice applied for and secured an injunction to halt the action. The danger, one of their lawyers said, had been ramping up by the hour. The MOJ said they expected officers to return to work with immediate effect.
Well, it's nearly an hour and a half since that injunction was granted, and they're still outside the prison here in Cardiff. They're awaiting clarification, they say, from others. But if they have to go in, then their message to the government is this: we need to know we're safe. It's as simple as that.
Shortly afterwards, the Prison Officers Association told its members protesting across England and Wales to comply with the injunction. Its General Secretary told Channel 4 News today's action worked. The MOJ had got the message.
Andy Davis reporting. We're joined now from North London by the chair of the Prison Officers Association, Mike Rolfe. Mike Rolfe, the government claims that it is doing something about this crisis by putting in another 2,500 prison officers across Britain. Is that not enough?
Well, they can't recruit and retain staff as it is, so increasing the prison officers' numbers simply just isn't going to cut it. They need to sort out the recruitment and retention crisis, but similarly, we don't believe 2,500 is enough. Back in 2010, since 2010, we've lost over 7,000 prison officers and 10,000 operational staff.
Well, it would suggest that if they can offer the right money, they'd get a good lot of them back.
Potentially, and that's one of the things we really wanted to secure. Is we wanted to talk about health and safety issues. We didn't want to bring pay into it at all, but one of the big issues is about recruiting and retaining staff. It's simply boots on the landing that makes prisons safe, and at the moment their own statistics show that prison numbers are falling. In the last 12 months they fell by over 416.
Well, I mean, this is really a genuine crisis, probably one of the worst crises in the prison system in the last few decades. I mean, you've got prisoners who are locked in all day in their cells. You've got people unable to attend court. The Joe Cox murder case has had to be suspended because they couldn't get the defendant to court. How long can this go on?
Well, we've obviously we've tried to take as much as a responsible approach as we can, but at the end of the day, the employer and government have blood on their hands here. There's been murders within prisons, there's been prison staff that have been killed escorting prisoners, we've got assaults daily, 16 members of staff, 65 assaults every day. As a prison officer, you've got a 1 in 3 chance of being assaulted each and every year. That's just simply unacceptable. We needed to act, and we needed to act now.
Have you had any access to the Minister?
We've been reassured that we will get a meeting with the Minister within the next 48 hours. That was the only reason we called off our action because we would have continued even though we was breaching the injunction. We realised the seriousness of that, but this is about people's lives, their safety, and that's more important than actually my freedom, to be honest.
So normal service will be restored tomorrow for 48 hours, or right now. What are you demanding out of the minister that will enable you to continue working after that?
Well, our demands haven't changed. We still want her to enforce safe regimes in both the public and private prison service throughout England and Wales. And then we want her to talk to us and reach an agreement on how we suitably recruit and retain prison officers. It's a very simple request. It's one that we've been asking for 2 weeks, and we simply haven't had it. And I would have to refute the fact that we were meant to meet the MOJ today. We were very clear that our deadline was the 11th of November, and they've painted us out to be liars. What they've in fact done is actually lied in the House of Commons and to the press to secure their injunction.
Mike Rolfe, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Mike Rolfe, the chair of the Prison Officers Association. Krishnan.
The government has announced the route for the second phase of the high-speed rail line HS2 from Crewe to Manchester and the West Midlands to Leeds. But there's still uncertainty over one of the routes through South Yorkshire. There'll be a spur into Sheffield city centre, a move which has raised concern among neighbouring towns who had been hoping for a station outside the city centre. It would also send the trains through a newly built housing estate in Mexborough near Doncaster. Some have been told their homes may be bulldozed. Our North of England correspondent Kieran Jenkins went to meet the anxious homeowners.
You've just moved into your dream new home. What could possibly go wrong? Well, how about a letter from HS2 saying they may well have to knock it down? Some of these homes in Mexborough near Doncaster are still being built. The government's preferred route for HS2 would see them demolished.
If we want to get passengers more seats on our suburban railways, we have to build more capacity. And if you're going to build more capacity, why wouldn't we build a state-of-the-art railway, fast, effective for the 21st century?
Here's how the government sees it looking from London to Manchester and Leeds. Originally, the route was planned to bypass Sheffield with a station outside the city. The new route is further east, but now with a spur into Sheffield city centre. Sheffield Council lobbied hard to get the route they favoured. If it's finalised after consultation, they say it'll be a huge boost for the city. But high-speed rail may now become less accessible for Rotherham, Doncaster and Mexborough. This community gets the tracks, but not the station. Now, of course, people here feel devastated that they may lose their brand new homes. But it matters on another level too, because there's a suspicion here that this sends a message that some places are more important than other places. And that if you feel that your community has been overlooked or forgotten, decisions like this make that resentment grow. So this is your lovely home?
It is, yes, our brand new retirement home.
Brand new? Sue and her husband bought this home believing the route would be miles away. They planned to be here for years. Is it going to be forever?
Not anymore.
Many people in the community, even business people, can't understand why it's coming through here unless it's because they think it's an area that doesn't really matter because of all the troubles in the past.
Is that how it feels to you?
Yes. Very, very much so.
Do you think the people making the decisions understand that?
They didn't even know we were here.
Within 17 years, you could be travelling through Sue's home if HS2 is delivered on time, as the government says it will be. An announcement this passenger group has welcomed. You're about better rail facilities for passengers, aren't you? That's what you want.
Yeah, we want a bigger, better railway.
And the people who live here aren't going to get a bigger, better railway. They're just going to get their house knocked down.
We've got to work with those people, or these people have got to work with the government to make sure that the impact is minimal, that the compensation is fair and just.
Compensation will be paid at 110% of the market rate. Some residents here believe that not only undervalues their homes, but their community too. Kieran Jenkins, Channel 4 News, Mexborough.
Now, the family of a 14-year-old schoolboy have spoken of their heartbreak after their son died after being taken ill in detention last Thursday. Nasser Ahmed's parents have accused the school of failing their son, who had severe asthma. But the school have said he was supervised at all times and had a care plan in place. Asad Beg has this report.
Nasser Ahmed, a 14-year-old boy from East London,
collapsed after suffering a severe asthma attack in school on Thursday. He was taken to hospital, where yesterday he died. Nasser was given a detention for tipping over a bin. His father was called into school. He pleaded with the school and his father that he was feeling unwell.
When the school phoned me between 11:40 and 11:50, I ran there. After getting there, they took me into a room. After taking me to the room, they said that my son has caused some problems. When they mentioned the trouble, my son put his hands together and said, "I will never do that again. I am not feeling well. Forgive me." After that, my son was taken to detention. I want proper justice for that. There should never again be any such injustice towards any son. No son should lose their life like this again.
The parents are distraught and very angry. They feel that the school didn't give their son the proper medication and hasn't communicated with them properly.
I think they didn't put in proper medical. They failed to give him proper medication. Proper medication means because his asthma attack, he can't take inhaler.
The school say Nasser was supervised at all times and were aware of his medical needs.
We will of course cooperate fully with investigations into the circumstances of this tragic incident and will also be undertaking a thorough review of what happened ourselves.
A post-mortem is ongoing and the coroner has been informed. The police said,
"The death is being treated as unexplained at this time. Officers from Tower Hamlets are conducting a number of inquiries in relation to the incident and the investigation is ongoing."
Nasser suffered from eczema. Here pictures show him when he was just a baby, his hands bandaged up to protect his skin. The family are still coming to terms with their loss. It's only been a day since Nasser died.
I lost my son, my big but I lost my son, but I believe I need proper justice. I want justice, and my thinking is in future didn't happen again like this.
This picture of Nasser before he died was released by the family. There will be some time before all the answers are known in this tragic case.
Asad Bed reporting after the break. We get reaction to Donald Trump's election as president from best-selling author Lionel Shriver, who once said President Trump was just too far-fetched for fiction. Welcome back. A reminder of tonight's top story. Barack Obama has arrived in Europe and spent the day in Greece in the final tour of his presidency. In a press conference, he warned of the dangers of what he called crude nationalism, what's been seen as a reference to his successor, Donald Trump. Well, the American novelist Lionel Shriver shouted, "What?" at the top of her lungs in the middle of an airport when she found out about the Donald Trump's election. In shock, she says that what she wrote in her book, The Mandibles, just might be coming true. The book takes place in an America that's becoming a pariah nation, and there's a wall between the United States and Mexico. But she has also expressed her sympathy with those white Americans who rallied to Trump's cause. She joins us now. And the thing about your wall, which of course was perfectly prophetic, is that in fact it was to stop Americans fleeing a disintegrating America into Mexico.
Yes. And I wrote that whole book before Trump started running for president, so he got the idea from me.
But you also, I mean, not only were wrong about the direction of the wall, I mean, in terms of who was going to cross it, but you also were pretty clear that he just couldn't win.
Oh, I was, along with everyone else, positively insouciant about Hillary Clinton winning this election. It's one of the reasons that I felt free to go on a literary festival tour of Asia during the election. And then I end up in Singapore airport, and I find out between two moving walkways by looking at the BBC, actually, breaking news, Donald J. Trump elected president. And I was absolutely floored. And it was like I got on the plane that had no Wi-Fi in one universe and I landed in another. It was almost Wizard of Oz.
But what about the rational explanation, which, I mean, a lot of people are beginning to recognise that very possibly, particularly the white voters for whom you have some sympathy, I mean, it's been called a white lash, which was against globalisation. Needless to say, Donald Trump is a beneficiary of globalisation and was voted by, into the presidency by people who have lost out of globalisation. But that is possibly true, isn't it?
Yes, and I think immigration is thrown into the mix. I've said that in some ways it's surprising that Trump didn't come around earlier because we're territorial animals. And to have that many people, others, come in from elsewhere and remain, welcoming and hospitable about it is a big ask, actually. And I think that for people who are doing very well, whites who are doing well, that's not especially painful because they have many other identities besides just being white or being among the dominant majority.
Is it clear that they've actually
make them feel good about themselves?
Got to that point? Isn't there, in fact, a degree of hysteria? And doesn't the system ensure that actually, in the end, you can't have a sort of situation in which one man goes mad and pushes a button and the world's at war?
Well, I think this is a good test of American constitutional democracy and the way it has been designed. The American presidency is much more powerful than it was originally envisioned in the Constitution. And Obama has been instrumental in increasing that power. I have been...
Well, he's been forced into that position by the Republican I mean, he's had to keep putting out presidential decrees.
But I said for ages that Democrats like the use of executive orders, which are just decrees, because Obama's in the White House. But you put a Republican in the White House and suddenly that power looks considerably more sinister.
So, I mean, OK, a week after it all happened, are you still depressed or is there a glimmer of a chance?
Well, there are 5 stages of grief. I've finally moved out of denial. That took a while. And the anger was too exhausting. I'm somewhere between bargaining and depression. The bargaining involves, well, you can get rid of the alternative minimum tax if you'll keep the Paris Climate Accord. That feeling of, well, there are some things that he can do that would be okay, and there are other things that he simply can't do constitutionally, and there are others that he can't do logistically.
Perhaps we should go from grope to hope. I'm going to have to leave it there, but let's, on that great optimistic thought.
Nothing else to do.
That's Channel 4 News. Good evening.